Prime Minister Hun Sen has been re-elected in a landslide victory in what critics are calling a flawed general election. Cambodia's National Electoral Commission says the election was successful, as the voter turnout was about 80%, the highest it's ever been. But the opposition party says the international community should fully reject the results.
The result announced by the CPP run in NEC, National Election Committee, must be fully rejected by the international community, such as the UN, ASEAN, the EU, IPU, or any democratic government and institution.
Caitlin McGee in Phnom Penh explains what this result means now for Cambodia.
So some strong condemnation from the outlawed opposition CNRP, who are in exile. Their vice president, speaking from Jakarta, described Sunday's vote as the death of democracy. Now, the international community has spent billions of dollars guiding Cambodia out of war to some sort of democratic process, and there are genuine fears now that that process has now collapsed. And the CNRP are calling on the international community to reject that vote. The White House has released a statement saying that it is considering sanctioning some Cambodians and has also described the election as flawed. And moving forward, international states like the US, the EU and other Western nations are going to have to consider how they will deal with this vote. Will they look at sanctioning Hun Sen and his inner circle, the Dirty Dozen as they're known? They've been identified by Human Rights Watch as being human rights abusers, or look at economic penalties. Cambodia is part of the EBA, the Everything But Arms Agreement, which is a trade treaty with the European Union. It allows Cambodia to export all of its products, except arms and ammunition, into the EU free of tariffs and quotas. That treaty is now under review, and if Cambodia were to be kicked out of it, it would be absolutely devastating for the economy and hundreds of thousands of workers who depend on it. So a balancing act now for the international community to try and figure out how to respond to this election, perhaps with sanctions on Hun Sen, but also with balancing that out and making sure they don't punish the millions of Cambodians in the country, many of whom are extremely poor.
Well, for more on this story, let's bring in Vannarith Chheang, Executive Director of Cambodian Institute for Cooperation and Peace. Prime Minister Hun Sen says his party has won all the parliamentary seats. It looks like a landslide win. How do you interpret the results?
Well, first, it's quite surprised because of the number of turnout voters is above 80%, and the CPP, the ruling party, grabbed all the seats, 125 seats, which may pose a certain challenge for the government to be formed after the election, because it may presents a new challenge because of multi-party political system without the participation of the small party in the National Assembly. But I believe that perhaps the government need to reform a certain law, election law and regulation in order to allow or to empower the small political party in the political system so that the multi-party liberal democracy prevails in this country.
And why do you think the turnout was so high? At 80%, that's quite a high number, given that the main opposition was not represented at all. And in the past, they have done well in local elections.
I think there's several reasons for that. First, perhaps the performance of the National Election Committee. They have much better much improvement in terms of voter registration in the computer system, more information sharing. They use technology such as social media, SMS through mobile phone from the National Election Committee to inform the people to go to vote. And of course, hard efforts by all means by the ruling party to convince people to go to vote. So that some of the explanation why the voter turnout rate was so high. It's a surprising number.
Just lastly, Vannarith, the international community is promising some kind of response. What would you find acceptable in terms of punitive action by the US or the EU after this vote? There are, of course, fears that any kind of punishment to trade in particular will affect thousands of factory workers.
I think it depends on how they interpret the election result, electoral process. So different opinions on it. But we need to be fair. Looking at the facts on the ground, more than 80% of Cambodians went out to vote. So it showed the political will and rise of the majority of the Cambodian people. So I think the legitimacy of the government is mainly decided, will be mainly decided by the Cambodian people themselves. Of course, I think the international pressure is mounting at this stage, especially the US and European Union. But by the end of the day, it's the Cambodian people who will decide their future.
All right, Vannarith Chheang, thank you so much for joining us with your analysis there from Phnom Penh.